Hi, good afternoon. My presentation is on the role of the reader. When we are talking about the role of the reader as it relates to textual criticism, we're looking at what the reader's response is to a given text. This approach is also called the reader-centered approach. Looking at the reader in the New Testament, we look at the position that the reader chooses to take in interpreting the text or how he responds to the text. Reading is not just a matter of perception, but also of production. When the reader reads, he does not so much as discover, but he also creates meaning. There would be no meaning of text if there were no readers. Another way of looking at it is looking at the text as a mirror. What can be seen in the text depends on who is standing in front of it. The contents of the mirror reflects who is looking in front of it. The historical background of readers' response criticism goes back to Kant's Copernican revolution, where knowledge was defined as a mind apprehending an object. Kant argued that the knower contributes something to the object of knowledge, and that the mind does not simply mirror but constructs its object, processing sensations outside the mind with the mind's own concepts. Literary gives us three ages of criticism. The first age is the author-oriented view. The author is the effect of the text. Understanding meant occupying the same place and perspective as the author. The second stage is we as readers are distant from the author. And the third, the language that comes between the reader and the author. These three elements are summed up as mind, time, and language. Once the author is removed from the text, literary critics have attempted to find the principles for how one determines the meaning based on the text alone when the author is removed. What does the reader do besides moving his eyes from left to right? Traditionally, he reads to get an understanding. In other words, to grasp the author's understanding. Reader response criticism takes it one step further to determine the meaning to the ways the text is received by the reader. That is to say, meaning is not simply reproduced, but produced. The challenge facing us as biblical interpreters is not the biblical text that we read, but our ways of interpreting them. The reader of the text is who the text was originally written to, the original readers, and also who is reading the text. There are two types of reader response criticism. The first is reader reception. Understanding is the end goal, and reading is more or less an obedient activity. Here, the reader respects the author's intentions and textual strategies. The opposite end of that spectrum is reader rejection. A radical reader. The text becomes an opportunity for the reader to pursue his or her own interests and agenda. Readers do not respond, they react. Reactionary readers lobby for their own respective causes and views. This can be dangerous because it goes against the history of the text's original interpretation. Here, the reader rejects the author's intentions and strategies. The process of understanding is between the text and the reader. Hans Georg Gadamer describes it as a fusion between two horizons. Let's look at reader response. The act of reading produces patterns and realizes meanings. Reading is a process of filling in the blanks, making connections. This is an implied reader who is an effect of the text. These readers are also called real readers that are active. Their activity is limited to a prescribed road laid down in the text that could be considered slavery to the text. The interpretation of the text differs as a result of the different interactions between the text proposal and the reader's response. Here, the reader is active, but his activity is oriented to just receiving the text. Then we have the radical response, which is the opposite spectrum. Here, the reader attempts to find and fix the meaning of the text. Radical readers resist any claim that either textual or interpretive pretend to be authoritative, exclusive, or absolute. The criteria for interpretation comes from the interpretive community that the reader belongs to. The reader belongs in a community, and what a reader discovers is a function of that community that he belongs to. And meaning is just a reading strategy brought out to the community. Let's look at John 6:54, when Jesus said, "Whosoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up in the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed." However, a radical reader could ask, did Jesus intend for us to actually eat his flesh and drink his blood? Is he suggesting cannibalism? A receptive reader would take into consideration the latter chapters of John 13 through 17, starting with the Last Supper, that has been a part of our Christian tradition and heritage, and where Jesus was telling the reader to do this in remembrance of him. The effectiveness of pros and cons of reader criticism is when looking at the effectiveness, a key concern is the nature of the activity and the reader's response. Will the reader respect or suspect them, or obey or rebel against them? To what extent does the reader response infect or effect the interpretive stages of understanding and application? When we speak of reader-centered criticism, it is the reader's claim to enjoy a privileged perspective from how they will use or evaluate the text. When a reader responds to the text, they must respond responsibly. When one is approaching the biblical text, they should seek to understand before overstanding. A reader should first determine the nature of the communication and the intent before seeking to evaluate it. In other words, what is the text trying to do? And how is it doing it? By doing so is to treat the text justly, entertain its perspective, and heed its voice. This approach requires honesty and integrity. It is important that a reader evaluate the significance of a text only after they have understood the sense of the text. Understanding precedes criticism, and interpretation precedes use. There is a difference between disagreeing about what one thinks about the text, what the text is trying to say, and deliberately reading the text. Green gives an example about a reader that says in his mind, "When I use a word, it means just what I mean, nothing more or nothing less." That strong-willed reading raises a question of interpretive violence. Doing this could victimize the text. Readers have to realize that the meaning of the text is there in the text. Readers have to read ethically. Since the text is the mercy of the reader should just let it be. Not in the sense of leaving it alone, but to allow it to fulfill its communicative purpose. The reader should be subject to the author's intent. An ethical reader gives the text attention. Only then can the text give something back. As biblical scholars, we have to be a servant and guard its otherness. The prime interpretation is to let the text have its say, which is to heed and hearken to the text's intention. As students of the Word, we have two models to help us understand how readers treat text. Competent readers need to know the Scriptures and the story of Jesus and must be a part of the community following and living out the gospel insights. If you are convinced that the text is inspired by the Spirit and therefore trustworthy, you can rest assured that you will receive the same illumination that was inspired by the original text. By knowing the character of Jesus, you already know how to receive the text, such as the one in John. This is why there should be a happy medium between the two models of the reader criticism.